Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Or maybe it's a different time of day where you are zooming in from, but welcome. I'm a Kuby. I'm an associate professor of history at UW-Madison, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this event today. We are in a discussion with all four authors of Still Lives, Jewish Photography in Nazi Germany. Still Lives came out with University of Pennsylvania Press earlier this year, in fact, at the start of 2025, and we are really delighted to be hosting its authors here at University of Wisconsin. Many thanks to the George L. Mosse Program in History and the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, as well as the UW-Madison Center for German and European Studies for making this event possible. I know a lot of people are grateful to get to hear these authors speak. We're going to be hearing from all four of the authors today. We also hope to make ample time for questions. So I'm going to keep my introductions brief. I'm going to introduce all four of the authors and then let them all jump in. Before we begin, let me remind everyone that we are running this session in a webinar format. So any questions that you have should be typed into the chat and I will read them aloud during the Q&A. You can please feel free to go ahead and pose questions as we go along. They will not get lost in the shuffle. I will keep track of questions that are asked. Let me introduce our speakers, the co-authors of Still Lives. Ofer Ashkenazi is a professor of history and the director of the Kobner Minerva Center for German History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He also currently serves as the vice dean for teaching affairs in the humanities. Still Lives constitutes his fourth monograph to explore Jewish contributions to German national culture throughout the 20th century. Others include Weimar film and modern Jewish identity in 2012, as well as Anti-Heimat Cinema, the Jewish invention of the German landscape, which came out in 2020. And these are among many other publications. Shira Miron is a PhD candidate in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Yale University and also a research assistant at the University of Basel. She's published in both English and German on the relationship between music and literature, German Jewish literature and culture, visual studies, theories of dialogue and communication, and a range of authors, including Novalis, Adorno, and Gertrude Kolmar. Sarah Wobick-Segev is a research associate at the Institute for Jewish Studies at the University of Hamburg. In addition to numerous articles, she's the author of Homes Away from Home, Jewish Belonging in 20th Century Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, which came out with Stanford in 2018. She is also a UW-Madison PhD and an alum of the Mosse program, so we're thrilled to have her back with us virtually today. Rebekka Grossmann is assistant professor of migration history at the University of Leiden. She has published widely with a focus on visual culture and photography in the history of migration and Jewish nationalism. Her most recent article, Moving Views, Global Routes of Jewish Refuge as Spaces of Early Humanitarian Seeing, was published just a few months ago in a collection titled Rethinking Jewish History and Memory Through Photography, which was co-edited by Ofer Ashkenazi. I am going to turn it over to the authors now, and remember, you can post questions as they speak, and those will come to me. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Emma, so much for being so generous with us and generous with your time. We are really excited to be here virtually. Over the years, Sarah, Rebekka, and I spent a lot of time at the Mosse building in different capacities. I believe I can say that the time in Madison was instrumental to our careers. So it's wonderful to be here, present our work at the UW this forum. We are grateful for the History Department, the CJS, Center for European German Studies, Mosse programs, Sky in particular, for facilitating this event. Okay, we're celebrating a book about photography. Maybe we should have a photo to look at, if I'll make it. Yeah. This is an awesome picture. We see a group of Jewish friends having fun at the beach. Look how carefree they are. Look how the joyful movement embedded here, the way they express their intimate friendship by embracing each other, how they look at us, including us in this moment of carefree intimacy. There is no trace of political situation in Germany, of anti-Semitism, just a fun moment between friends. The most incredible thing about this photo is that it should not have existed. It was taken in a vacation resort on the island of Norderney in the summer of 1935. Norderney was a known Nazi stronghold that already in the summer of 1933 prided itself on being completely Judenfrei, a place without Jews. When you take this into account, there's flavor of in-your-face element in this image. You do not allow us Jews, and we are nonetheless here. Maybe because you cannot really distinguish us from other Germans. There's something clearly artificial about it. Look how hard are they trying to show that they are carefree. This is obviously not a snapshot, but rather a well choreographed image. They carefully staged it to look like it. It is staged as in your face moment. We are here and we belong here. This is pretty nice. Now pay attention to another curious item here, the suitcases. They are apparently picnic accessories to help carry food and towels to the beach. That makes sense. But for Jews in late 1935 Germany, such suitcases are also a clear signifier for emigration. With so many people forced to leave or trying desperately to leave, suitcases have become a symbol of the time, particularly in Jewish visual culture in Germany, as in this montage by Pisarik, Avram Pisarik, you can see here with the title we are waiting to emigrate," and the suitcases that control this image. So this image tells at least two stories that seem to contradict one another, one about belonging and the other about the inevitable prospect of living. One of the things we realized in our research is that such ironical approach to reality becomes increasingly popular in the photos that Jews took in Nazi Germany. And this is different from what you would find in many written sources of the time. The book sums up our studies of tens of thousands of such photographs, and we want to make two arguments in it. The first one, if you are interested in Jews' experience in Nazi Germany, you must consider photographs they produced, preserved, and displayed. We view photographs not as documentation of reality, but rather as comments about it. Rich and multi-layered comments that communicate views, emotions, identities, and a sense of agency. In order to integrate photographs in historical explanations, you should, that would be the second argument that we make, you should seriously think about a systematic methodology, how to unfold the different meanings of a photo, how to connect it with other elements of Jewish experience, with other contemporaneous discourses. This is what the book is trying to do. Let us dwell another minute on the photographs, on why photographs are so important as a historical resource. First thing, it has to do with the question, who is actually taking photographs at the time? The answer is easy, everyone. The new cheap, small, and easy-to-use cameras made it a household object in Germany ever since the mid-1920s, and everybody uses it. Children, women, men, elderly people, etc., etc. And it's really interesting that they could continue to do it throughout the 1930s in Nazi Germany as Jews. We can talk later why it was the case, but they went on and took photos all the time throughout the Nazi years, or at least until the early 40s. And another thing to take into consideration is the fact that by the time not the Nazis took power, amateur photographers were quite photo literate. They read magazines and manuals and photo books, and they learned how to constitute a good image and how the visual symbolism gives meaning to images, etc., etc. And finally, really important, they were aware of the political significance of mundane or vernacular photography. Joseph Goebbels talked about the army of photographers who will capture the real soul of Germany without Jews, without Democrats, and so forth. This message was not lost on the Jews in Germany, who also called for, having our own army of amateur photographers to show the real Germany as we see it, with um, Jews as part of the nation, of the landscapes, and so forth. So this book takes this background seriously and introduced methodology that takes into account major trends in the photographs Jews, the themes, the locations, the styles they use, as well as the way photos introduced intricate narratives about the experience of being Jewish in Nazi Germany. What we'll do now, we'll just give you a few examples of how it looks like, what we were interested in this book, some case studies that will give you a taste of what we found so fascinating about it. Wait. Okay.
Oh, you jumped one over.
I know. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ofer. So as Ofer's already made clear, there were a variety of small, easy to use, and comparatively cheap cameras, such as the Leica, Agfa Billy, the box cameras of Zeiss and the Agfa, that really flooded the market by the mid to late 1920s. And film, filament, and photo albums as well became much cheaper too. Photography clubs, journals, and even guidebooks for children, like this one in front of you, helped amateurs master this wildly popular hobby, or at least become somewhat adept at it. And this short guide on photography, written explicitly for children, is but one example of both the popularity of photography, but also how common it was for children and youth to have and to use cameras. And one of my personal favorite collections, and one that I've had the pleasure of working on a fair bit, is an album compiled and based largely on the photos taken by a young Jewish girl named Marianne Hollander. Next slide, please. Okay, Marianne, who we'll see shortly, came from the city of Köln, in English Cologne, on the Rhine River, in the west of Germany, not too far from Belgium and the Netherlands. Can we click her in, please? While Jewish children would only be officially banned from attending public schools in 1938, quotas and an increasingly hostile environment compelled many Jewish children and their parents to seek alternative educational spaces well before that time. So already in 1933, one such institution was a rural residential school in Herlingen. Herlingen is a small town in the south of Germany, not too far from Stuttgart. And this school was transformed already in 1933 into a Jewish residential school under the direction of an educator named Hugo Rosenthal. The school was open from 1934 to early 1939, and Marianne was one of the few students to attend the school for nearly the entire time. And her album, in fact, bears witness to these few school years and to the children and teachers who came and went. We don't know too much about Marianne. She did succeed in escaping Nazi Germany in 1939. She fled to England, but she also passed away sometime around 1953, though it was never able to determine what the cause of her death was. What makes her album remarkable is the fact that it was captioned twice, first by Marianne, and then later by Rosenthal, who again was the headmaster of the school. The other compelling aspect of this album is that it's connected to the much wider archival collection that Rosenthal donated to Yad Vashem, which included a rich a number of newspapers, even a story written by Mariana, and references to her birthday. Here we see two portraits of Mariana that can be found in the album. The second, to the left, also shows her holding her box camera at chest height. One of the fascinating aspects of this album, beyond the clear interactions that we see in the texts between Mariana and Hugo Rosenthal, these captionings, these double layers of captioning, are the ways in which the album shows how Mariana negotiated her understanding of her place as a Jewish and German child going to school in southern Germany. The album also speaks to her sophistication as a photographer and observer, something we can see time and again in albums of children, and something that we don't typically get in written sources. Can we click one more time, please, on this? And to our next slide, sorry. In the following slide, we see but a few examples of how Mariana played with motifs and subject matter connected to the topic of Heimat, homeland, one that was used and abused by the National Socialists to define what it supposedly meant to be German, but also used to exclude others. And as we note in our book, using several examples, Jews employed abstracted and generic Heimat imagery commonly to both instantiate connections to Germany and also to question these connections. There was also aspects of using Heimat that reflected very stubborn acts of defiance. We're here, we belong. And the children at the school, they hiked frequently in the area and even learned something called Heimatkunde. Heimatkunde is essentially something like social studies, but a really strong eye to the local context, to this notion of homeland. And it's really interesting to see here how, albeit from different pictures, Hollander incorporated professional images, especially at the top and at the bottom, with her own attempts to visually capture and reproduce what we could call typical Heimat-themed elements found in the local landscape, including churches, major historical landmarks, or towns situated in pleasant rural landscapes seen from afar. So she's adopting a visual rhetoric already at the age of roughly 12, maybe 13. And in so doing, she's participating in this Heimat discourse and making the images though her own, both by taking them and then reproducing them in her album. Now, later, some of her schoolmates, long after the fact, might have argued and did argue that the children during this time and the teachers had no longer felt that they were part of the local landscape, that they didn't belong. They knew that they didn't belong. At least they say in their written testimonies later, many years later. Mariana's album actually suggests that it wasn't so simple, that this tension between belonging and not belonging is actually something that they were negotiating at the time. Susan Sontag long ago remarked that even tourists take photos of places to create a sense of belonging to and participation in something. And here we can see through Hollander's photo album and the sheer number of abstracted Heimat-themed images that the search for belonging went much deeper, even if these images in the end represent a quest for what would only be a temporary home. Mariana's photo album is thus a really remarkable source on how Jewish youths set about trying to understand their identities as Germans, Jews, boys and girls, students with dreams and hopes. And although children could try to answer these very large questions of who I am and where I belong quite seriously, as we see in these photos, they often used humor. That brings us to our next slide. For Purim, a carnival-like holiday that commemorates the miraculous rescue of Jews from the genocidal plans of the arch-enemy, Haman, the children at the Landschulheim would dress up every year. To the right, one girl is dressed in the traditional costume of the local non-Jewish Swabian population, while to the left, two children are dressed up as a Hasidic rabbi and his wife. Neither of these identities are what we could call authentic, though, for the Jewish students who came from predominantly culturated German Jewish families from the north. Again, Mariana is from Cologne. Next slide. Another year, all the children chose costumes collectively. Mariana's small group dressed up as Japanese women, while others dressed up, for example, as Bedouins or ancient Egyptians. Of course, this is not exactly what we would say or call politically correct today. Nevertheless, these acts of dressing up in the costume of other cultures allowed for the children to play further with identities and engage in fantasies of being far away from harm's way, either in time or in space, or both. By becoming Japanese ladies for one day, and here we see Mariana herself dressed up as a Japanese lady, they were able to discard both German and Jewish identities and escape the complexities of their daily life in Nazi Germany, even for a day. Rebekka?
Yes, so with the album of Marianne Hollander, we see that oftentimes these teenagers were actually not so much working and taking photographs as part of their own homes or families, but in alternative institutions for different reasons. But what we see often is that these institutions actually encouraged taking photographs. So we know that not only adults, but also teenagers had cameras and that they used them and that they used them to like very consciously to express what they were seeing and feeling at the time. And it was not only those closed institutions like a home, like a school, but also Jewish youth movements or clubs. One example that we know of is from a Jewish youth center in Frankfurt, which in the summer of 1934 called on young readers of the Frankfurter Israelitisches Gemeindeblatt to take part in a photo competition. The best photos of these excursions, of the excursions they had taken during the summer, would be shown in an exhibition. And the results would then be praised for the wit and creativity with which these young people traveled. For example, when they got around in cars, so hitchhiking, or even there were some that managed to jump on coal barges on the Rhine. And then these photos were really taken in all sorts of corners of Germany. And then the article said, summarizing what this exhibition showed, that these photographs are a sign, and here I'm quoting, that our young people know how to find the most beautiful places on their own. And we really have lots of these photographs that show us how teenagers were traveling on their own, often in small groups, because as of 1934, it was not possible for them any longer to travel in larger groups. But here, for example, we have the album of Rudi Bartha, who is documenting how he hitchhiked from Berlin to Zurich, so through all of Germany. And on the opposite page, he also praises this life of hitchhiking as the utmost freedom. And in documenting this trip with his camera, he was both performing and also, creating a memory of this freedom. And it is really that we have a lot of advantages when we look at teenager photographs, because teenagers not only documented their travels, which also adults did, but they also documented what they saw around them in the cities. And this is where we see a difference between teenagers and adults, at least between teenagers and professional photographers, because we have an example of Roman Vishniak in the next slide, in which we see, and you might know such photographs of Roman Vishniak, that he took photographs of his daughter, Mara, in front of conspicuous places all across Berlin, like in this case here, where there is a window that sells or at least shows tools for like pseudo-scientific purposes of Rassenpflege, so race science. You might know Roman Vishniak because he also took photographs for the JDC in the later 1930s, which he would much later then publish in a book that he called A Vanished World, Photographs of Eastern Europe. But he lived in Berlin at the time and he was trying to document what was happening around him. But he always took his daughter with him to have like an excuse if he would be asked why he's taking photographs. And we see this we see big differences between his approaches and those of teenagers. We have, for example, the collection of Abraham Ziv in the following slide. Here we have an example of this collection, who was born in Bonn in 1920 to parents who had come to Bonn from Poland after the First World War. So the family never received German citizenship, but Abraham Ziv was very much at home in Bonn, and he documented the city and its surroundings with the camera, but he also documented very much what he saw that was going on around him, including different activities of his fellow Bonn population. This one here, for example, is part of the 1938 Carnival Parade. It's quite ironic because we see the group, the Närrische Liederfreunde Bonn, so it's like a carnivalistic choir that is on their banner inviting everyone to join and have fun. And that's, of course, at a time in which Jews have long been banned from joining carnival associations. And he nevertheless joins this celebration of fun, and he documents it. And at the same time, we see he's not doing this carelessly. He is taking care that he's not really being seen. The people that we see in this photograph don't really look at him, but he makes sure that he captures this. Another photograph of the carnival celebration is 1 year later in 1939, and here we see a distinct difference because now he is documenting the parade from his window, from the secure distance of his window. Of course, we know what has happened in between the pogroms of November 1938. Before that, some of his family members have been deported to Poland in October 1938, and it is very dangerous for people to be in public, openly Jewish. So now he's choosing the distance of his window, but he is also still making sure that he is showing what is going on. It is even giving him a certain degree of control to document this from above. So he's following what is happening from kind of a bird's eye view. Other pictures show that he is interested in documenting political events. For example, here we have one of the very few photographs of a Hitler Youth parade, which is taking place in a central square in front of the Bonn Cathedral. Even more than in other pictures, the quality of the photograph shows that he's taking this from a relative distance. There are also people in front of him. So again, he's very conscious of what he's doing and at the same time very adamant of showing what he sees. And in such an atmosphere, Ziev's family, like many other Jewish family at the time, would increasingly gather indoors, and we see photographs that show his family members and often also see distinct hints of what is happening to them. For example, sometimes there are in these years family celebrations with family members with shaved heads because they have just recently returned from the concentration camp. So he's not hiding what is happening to him and his family. In February and March 1939, at the same time that he was documenting the carnival parade from his window, he and other Jewish youth were conscripted into forced labor. And this experience too was documented by Ziev shortly before he left Bonn for Belgium with the negatives in his luggage. He would migrate, he would go to Palestine, where his older sister was already living at the time, but his younger brother and parents would be killed in the Holocaust. Taken together, these pictures of Abraham Ziev, there are 270 in number, which he all took to Palestine and then later returned to the Bonn archives, can be understood as active acts of participation in a time of marginalization. He saw and observed the people of Bonn. He also saw and observed and documented Bonn as his own city. He probably put himself in danger quite a lot by simply pressing the shutter, but at the same time, in this case and also in other cases, the camera is almost like a protective shield with which these teenagers were able to remain seemingly unseen while capturing this ostensibly quite banal everyday life under National Socialism. And so it's a chronicle and also, it's a chronicle of belonging and also loss at the same time. And thereby I hand over to Shira.
Yes, and we will conclude with this last case study before we go on to the Q&A by reflecting on the very possibility of photography to narrate and to conclude narratives. This is a major aspect of our research towards a database of photographies was when were the photos taken? So we have a timeline of 1933 to 1945, but obviously most of the pictures were taken until 1938. The pictures that we have. And then we have very few pictures that were taken afterwards. But the question about concluding a narrative is also about the very, we heard here about implicit and explicit usages of the medium, about the possibility of the photographer and the different agents who participate in the making of the photo, to tell and to conclude their story and the story of the experience of being Jew in Nazi Germany. And with this specific album that we found at the Institut für die Geschichte der deutschen Juden in Hamburg, we have a very particular case of a family of two parents who, with and through the medium of photography, took ownership of their own experience of exclusion and discrimination, and eventually forced migration from Germany, and turned it into this album. So I suggest that we will before we move to the first page, I will say a few words about the family. The family of the von der Porten was a very established family in Hamburg, the 11th generation. The parents, Ernst and Friede von der Porten, lived in Germany throughout the 30s until, and in May 1938, as the medical license of the father was denied with the severe legislation of this year, they finally decided to leave Germany. By that time, 1938, all their three daughters were already in other parts of Europe, and one of the daughters, Gerda von der Porten, lived since 1934 in Zurich, where she continued her medical studies after she wasn't able to do that in Heidelberg. So I suggest we will move to the first page of this album. It's a bit larger than a pocket size, this album, and we have between the pages, which is typical wax papers. And the first page of the album opens with a dedication, and I will read it shortly in German. Meiner geliebten Gerda zur Erinnerung an ihr Eltern- und Geburtshaus in Hamburg, Mittelweg 118, Mai 1938. And we have here with this dedication in memory of your parents and your birth house in Hamburg, Mittelweg 118, May 1938. Very clear, very concrete time signature, time and place signature, which is a rare thing to have in such accuracy in our in the different photos that we dealt with. We have the street, the home, and the designation of the place of the object of photography as the parents and birth house, and this was quite literally the birth house of Gerda. Gerda and the other two daughters were born in this house, and before the parents leave this house, they know the daughters won't be able to take farewell, and they take this album as a symbolic act of farewell from the childhood, from the family, from the existence in Germany. I suggest we'll move to the first page in the album. And we have in this album only 7 photos that document that go through, the camera goes through the rooms in the apartment. And as you see, what we have here is probably a professional photographer that was commissioned with this work, just to document the house without the tenants. So we have here in May 1938, the parents are taking ownership of this very constitutive moment in the history of the family by defining themselves what the house is, as they are deprived of their existence as a family and as owners of this place in Germany. as we move on, we can see that in none of the pictures we can see the family members. We see here familiar corners, seating. I mean, we see in each one of the photos we see seating corners and seating arrangements with conspicuously empty chairs, empty lived space, and thereby we see how the album really undermine and empties this lived space from from the family life that used to define it as the house of the daughter. And this is the last photo. And with the last photo, we enter the most intimate place in the family home. This is the bedroom of the parents, where we see as a mise en abîme the three pictures of the daughters, two of them on the wall and one of them on this small table in front of the bed. And again, I remind you that the daughters were actually born in this house. So we have here this very symbolic move from the representative space in the beginning towards the sanctum of the house, and the very coming to being of the family as a family. This page concludes the album. The rest of the album remains empty. And we see here in this album not only the possibility of the medium of photography, of the specific medium of photography, to capture a moment and to define a memory, to define a present moment as a moment that is already gone, but also the very existence, the very portability of the album plays here a significant role. This album is being sent together in Zurich. This is how it survived. The parents managed in the last moment in May 1938 via the Belgian council, Ernst von der Porten was his physician, to obtain a visa and to move to Brussels. In 1943, the two parents commit suicide in Belgium, and Gerda is practically the only family member from the nuclear family who used to live in this house and defined it as the family house, who remains, who survives in Switzerland. And with this final example that we wanted to show today, we also wanted to finish with a reflection about the afterlife of the object that we dealt with. And in many regards, I mean, we have this time frame of 1933 to 1945, but many, actually all of the pictures that we encountered had afterlives after this historical moment. And in this specific album, we see the afterlife being actually designed and curated in real time in 1938. But the fact that this album then goes together and then ends up being in South America and being returned to Hamburg, not far away from the place, from the house where it was taken, tells us about the way the story of this photograph, the story of this medium that can really capture a moment and a place, actually connect so many dots and so many places with its with its sheer materiality, and also with its symbolic power and significance. Yeah, and I think we can maybe show the last photo, which is an empty one. The rest of the album remains empty, and you can keep on. I mean, it's clear that it was very, if we talk about agency, it was very clearly designed to be the story with these 7 images after the dedication, and the rest remain empty as maybe as the life that weren't lived, or the future possibilities that the owner of the album, Gerda von der Porten, will be able to have outside of Germany.
Thank you all so much. So just as a reminder to everyone, a number of questions have already come in through the Q&A. While some other people are typing their questions, I'm gonna just take my prerogative and maybe ask one to start off this part of the session. We have plenty of time. I was wondering if you all can talk to us a little bit about the construction of your archive, um, about kind of how you put together the set of photographs that you've referred to a database of 15,000 photos. Where did they come from, and how did you kind of build them into a set of materials that you were going to talk about here? This might also address some other questions that I think people have, professional photography, in the sources that you are looking at.
All right, let me start taking it, and then the other authors can jump in. I think the problem with the photos was not where we can find them, but where not. They, they were everywhere in
Yes.
archives, some Jewish museum and Holocaust museums, but also archives of small towns, and like we saw Bonn and Hamburg, and many private collections that we got to. And so the problem was to when to stop. So we stopped with around 15,000 photos, but we could go on and on. We keep getting more photos and more collections from private people, and so it's in the database. Um, and then how we thought of organizing it. So we knew that in order to say anything about these photos, we need to somehow figure out the major trends. So, to see what kind of events people take photos of, what kind of places are photographed. And we started by doing kind of a spatial analysis of of certain places, certain categories of places, and how are they documented. So we had three major ones: the Jewish home, because as you could see, many of the photos were taken of the Jewish home, and then the Nazified landscape of Germany outside of the Jewish home, and then some Jewish spaces, designated like synagogues and hachshara training camps and schools and so on and so forth. So we looked at that and we organized our database according to these categories.
I can maybe
Um,
yeah,
Go
just
ahead,
jump
please.
in and say something about the specific moment. So we started to collect the images, the photos towards the project around 2016, and we started writing the book around 2019, 20. And this specific time, I mean, it's possible also to see how the moment where we wrote the book had a role and had influence on the database, because we managed actually to get and to interview some of the people who took the photographs, and I'm pretty sure that unfortunately none of them is with us anymore. So it was the very last moment where we could do that. At the same time, it was already in a time where, for example, major archives like the Archive of the Jewish Museum in Berlin had lots of materials already being digitized. So, I mean, you could say it's a sweet spot, but I think the point is that in every different moment, such a book would have looked very, very differently. So we have this very last moment of still being able to interview. Of course, the people that we interviewed were children who took photos, and have a connection to these archives in this very advanced stage. So it's a question how such a book would have looked like if we would have written it 10 years ago, such a book in 20 years from now.
Thank you. I'm gonna maybe pull together a couple of the questions that have come through that are about kind of mechanics here. One of the first questions we received, which is from Shelley Shapiro, is who developed the photos? the Nazis wouldn't have wanted Jews to be able to photograph. And then I'm going to maybe pair that with a question that has come in from Keith Patiz, that asks, how was it that these pictures survived? Were they primarily taken by people who were able to emigrate? So maybe just if you can answer kind of at those two key points in the material life of the photographs, kind of what did that look like?
I guess I could say a little bit about about the migration history. It's true that a number of the collections that we have definitely came as a result of migration, thanks to people being able to leave. And in that sense, we actually see a significant downtick in the number of available sources after 1938, 1939. It's also when life becomes a lot more challenging, dangerous. It's the beginning of the war in 39. So that definitely has an impact. But we know, we do have some, again, Rebekka's collection there from the ZIF, which had traveled as well back and forth, does land eventually today in a German archive. And so there is sometimes moments where these collections come back later, interestingly enough. But that was definitely one of the things that we noticed and were aware of, that a lot of the sources that we had at our fingertips were we were able to work with precisely because people had been able to leave and take them. And sometimes the earlier they could leave, the more photographs they could take, the more money and resources they had to take more things with them.
Yeah, and maybe I can say something about how they were developed. So actually, many of the photographers, some of that we could still talk to, and from others we know it via other sources, could develop their photographs in just very normal shops and in studios and with commercial photographers. So until quite late, and they would really have to show that they are Jewish, so it wasn't really obvious. But we also know that there is a conscious engagement with photography among people who either were looking for jobs within Germany or also especially outside. And there were advertisements in Jewish newspapers on I would like to learn photography and photographic development, and others advertised their skills to teach photography. So some people would actually set up their own dark rooms in their homes or in the youth homes. We also have it that they were able to develop the photographs themselves. And then some of the people who migrated took these photographic skills with them. And not rarely we see that they then, in the places they migrated to, opened photo studios, which was, of course, a job that they didn't really need the language for example, and that helped them to have an income in the new place.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Oh, sorry, did I cut somebody off? Okay. Let's see. I I have a question here from Fran Hirsch that I will maybe build on as well. Fran says, this is such an interesting and important project. How many of the photos do you think were intended as acts of resistance versus acts of participation, or are these the same things? So since that's a plenty large question on its own, but I'll also I'll throw in whether you all find the language of witnessing, of bearing witness, like a helpful framework for thinking about this project or not, whether that is, do any of these frameworks of thinking about the photos as resistance, as acts of bearing witness, as acts of participation, do you think of them in these terms, or are those frameworks that you actually don't find helpful for thinking about these sources?
Let me start that, and then we'll see. I'm curious what the others think about it. So I don't think it's very productive to think about it as act of resistance, even though it is, right? It's an act of taking responsibility of the way we document ourselves, the way the people will remember us in the future, demonstrating agency, definitely. And we saw a few examples of that, definitely. However, and I mentioned it very briefly, but what we really see is a shift into this ironic approach where you have both resistance but also acceptance, and where you have both we belong here and also we have to go. Um, and this is something that if you look at many written resources from that time, written sources, you'll see a lot of pathos and pathos of victimization and pathos of we are going to resist, or pathos we are going to build our own homeland somewhere else. And when you look at photographs, you see a shift from pathos to irony with the 1930s. And when you look at narratives that photographs make, you see it even stronger. So I don't think as one category of resistance or acceptance or victimhoods or agency would work. We actually see an effort to have this intricate message of we live in under extreme uncertainty conditions, and we're trying to figure out what's going on here.
And maybe I can add here something shortly, because we did, of course, look at different photographers. While we do have a focus on vernacular photography, we also look at some of the professionals. And I think that there it's interesting to make a comparison. First of all, many professionals actually left Germany very early on, so including people like Alfred Eisenstedt, who I think is mentioned in the comments. He left in 1935, and many others, because they were actually able to work in other places due to their networks and so on. But some stayed, especially Abraham Pisarik and Herbert Sonnenfeld, and for them we often see almost a sense of mission in their work, also because they worked for the Jewish Kulturbund, the Culture League, and they were actively documenting and also creating montages that, for example, would show what it would mean for people to migrate, to tell stories of migration, but also kind of encourage people to migrate. And so I think with them, it is easier to create or to see such conscious acts. But at the same time, I think it's also depending on when you look at photographs of amateur photographers. We have those who are very consciously taking photographs very early on, like the person that wrote the text that Jews should also engage in documentation, like a certain Mr. Meyer. He was part of an amateur association and was actually excluded from the German Amateur Association and suggested founding a new one, a Jewish one. But then we also have people who start out quite, like without this kind of ideas, and then we see as times go on that they probably adopt more conscious approaches. And at the same, and ultimately we can't know, of course, for sure, but we have also those cases where things change over time.
I might just say a quick addition on the idea that things change over time, and going back to the question of afterlives. We see in the choice of the families, the family members, or other more distant relatives to, for example, donate their images, donate the albums to specific institutions, also an act of framing the photos as perhaps a testimony or witnessing. And this is also a point where the question what Jewish photography really gets tricky at times. We have albums of converted Jews who took photos as converted Jews and not as Jewish individuals, but then the photos ended up being donated to Jewish institutions in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and their meaning is being reconfigured. So it is really a flexible moment, and the question who is testifying, who is witnessing what, and who actually makes the explicit move is very complicated. And we sometimes also have it on a single page of an album. We have captions that were added in retrospect, even by the same person. We have children, for example, who take the albums with them and then add some captions. So we have the distance, the time lag between the actual moment of photography and the narration. And in this moment, not only history occurs, but also the way that the processing of the idea of why are we taking the photograph. So this is certainly something that also our photographers are reflecting upon.
And it's not just the photographers themselves, it's also us. We become part of that. We are actually witnessing that. And I'm thinking of some of the collections that I know from the Holocaust Museum in Washington. They don't do it as much anymore, but there used to be a time that they would select photos themselves based on who had passed away in a family. So the collections would be given to them, people would bring in photos, and then the archivists themselves would make a choice of what would come into the archive and what not with a certain choice. And that would actually lend it would change the reading in a sense, because it wouldn't be a full collection. It would be it would help actually a certain notion of resistance, or perhaps the narrative of pathos that Ofer was speaking to as well. And yet on one hand, you have these people standing in front of the camera trying to substantiate their presence by virtue of being photographed, but our own timing, and the timing of when we look at these photos, makes us a participant in the interpretation of that as well. I think that also answers in part one of the questions that I see in the side here, is that these are never just documents. Even if they tell you, here's the table, here's the chair, and here's where mommy and daddy slept. They are also statements. They are comments on the life that people were living and what they were giving up and forced to give up at a time.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm gonna raise one of the questions here, just maybe as an invitation to you all to talk a little bit more about the portions of the book that kind of do this. William Rosen says, I've always been fascinated by the photographs of Anne Frank and her family. The photographs pretty well documented her family life. Did you find photographs from other Jewish families that provided such visual documentation? So,
I think the short answer would be yes, definitely. Hundreds, if not thousands of them are out there. And many of them are as detailed as the one you mentioned here. Anne Frank was not part of our this project because again it got too big, and we tried to look at photos that were taken in Germany before migration. Even though in some cases we looked at what happens when they leave, but definitely this is a good example of the kind of materials that we found and tried to say something in general about them.
Emma, you're on silent.
I'm so sorry. Why don't we go? There are a number of questions in the comments. People were very interested in the photography book for children, and in fact, we might we might pull it back up. So a couple of people, Jill Maidenberg and Herb Lewis, have asked whether the child is wearing a kippah on the cover of this book, whether this was a photography book intended specifically for Jewish children, and then there is also a question about the booklet from Deep Acharya that goes in a different direction. I'll read that one out loud. He says, I'm really interested in the Werner Graf Otto's photos that was mentioned in the presentation, considering it was published by the Stuttgart Verlag. Who was this publication's audience? Do we have any trace of how it was received, considering the publicity this publishing house had?
Well, I can add a little bit of information about it, and then Shira, you can please help join. So first of all, it's published in 1932. From what I could tell, though, the head covering, though it looks so much like a kippah, is not actually intended as such. It's not written about a Jewish boy. It's written for a general audience. Werner Graf was not Jewish, though he worked with several sort of more left-wing avant-garde artists and with the Ryman family in Berlin, if I remember, and they did eventually have to flee to England, to answer another question, in late 1930s. So it's a pre-Nazi document in it, but what's fascinating is it just gives us an idea of already really early on how much energy and money and paper and ink is being spent on teaching children how to take photos. And it has some really fun little parts where he explains how to take photos clandestinely, which I'm not sure whether we should be teaching children to do, but that's part of it. So you have a very layered text written very in a colloquial, child-friendly format as a narrative too.
Yeah, I just something about the audience. We only found, I mean, it was pretty hard to get to a copy of this book. Astonishingly, at the end I managed to get hold of it in a branch of the Children and Youth Bibliothek of the State Library of Berlin, which is in a very far way, not by no means inviting for children and youth to go in and take a look at this book today. So yeah, at the same, it's certainly part of a trend and something that attests culture of photography that is wider than what we see at the project. But this is also part of what we are trying to do by looking at this cultural context as the immediate backdrop and point of reference for our protagonists. And this also relates to the question of families. Yes, taking photos at home was a common praxis during that time, and Jews participated in it. And this is also why we want to take a look at this specific instantiation of this cultural phenomenon that is wider than what we're looking at here.
Great. I have a question that I think kind of flows out nicely from this. This is from Elizabeth Price. And her question is about how you all worked with children as actors in this history alongside adults as actors. Did you consider them differently? Did you consider the photographs that they produced differently because of their different perspectives? In other words, how did children's history kind of and its methodological approaches impact the story that you wanted to tell?
Sarah, you want to take this?
Yeah, thanks. So definitely took them differently. You kind of have to in many respects. And it's actually because of the fact that we have children and youth photographs taken by children and youth that was just really appealing to deal with, because we don't have too many. I mean, children were taking a lot more photos than they were leaving diaries. And that in and of itself is fascinating. And so if we think about the Hellingen context, what was really fascinating also is the back and forth between the expectations of what Marianne thought the adult world was and what it was supposed to be, and then elements of child play that would make it in. So like we could see even how a child would take a picture differently of agricultural elements. So this is a time when many young Jewish men and women are learning how to be good agriculturalists, because they're going to move to the United States, maybe, but predominantly to Palestine, and they're going to till the land and milk some cows or some goats. And you have proper pictures from professionals where you have people learning, they're well dressed, they're taking pictures of milking the animals, they're learning their trades. It's very serious work. And in Marianne's collection, she has a picture, for instance, of a little lamb in the hands of one of the kids, and the lamb is basically erasing the face of one of the children, and they're just giggling. And you have this picture of these children thinking that this is the funniest thing that they've ever seen in their lives. Here are a bunch of city kids, Köln, Berlin, everywhere, and they're playing with the animals. And so we definitely have these different expectations, but we also see stories of growing up, both in that album and in others. But I think Rebekka's find with the Zeev collection really also showed us that youths, especially young men, like teenage boys, were so much more fearless. They really, I mean, they were hitchhiking. Zeev also hitchhiked. The Bati collection, he's hitchhiking. They are not afraid. They're taking their photos. I noticed in the side that somebody was talking about where and when people would feel comfortable being photographed, and that's true. Adults were not standing in the middle of the road saying, "Hey, I'm Jewish, let's take a picture of me." They were frightened. First of all, there were cases of confiscation long before it became a policy. And the adults had internalized this and they photographed differently as a result of it. And we have several great examples. Shira also came across some collections of Frankenstein collection. They're not worried. They seem to be oblivious, or they know that they're small and unassuming and their cameras are here sitting on the chest side and they can get some great shots in the thick of things. And that's remarkable. That was one of the things that we definitely took into account and noticed pretty quickly as well.
Wonderful. Let's see. So, I think we have about 10 minutes left. We are going to wrap up by 12:15 or so. So we have time for me to try to get to a few more of these great questions. So why don't I ask Eleanor Conrad's question? She asks, were there any photos that you came across that surprised you in this project? And I'm assuming the answer to that question is yes. I mean, maybe you could talk about maybe some of you would be willing to talk just kind of more broadly about the affective work of dealing with these sources, confronting these images full of life. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I can
Go
go
ahead.
because I was kind of looking forward to this question. I think everyone thinks of a different collection here, but one that I would talk about is that of Martha Maas, who was a professional photographer who actually started working as a studio photographer when everyone else stopped. That was in late 1935. So, as I said, lots of professionals had already left. Also, because this was a time of Aryanization of shops, so-called Aryanization, and people had to sell for very low prices and then go on and leave. So she does the opposite. She goes to Berlin. She had learned photography in Berlin and then left for her hometown Aachen, where she was a studio photographer. And she returned to Berlin, where she started as a studio photographer in the 1930s again. And yeah, so during these last years before she too has to close in late 1938, she takes portraits of German singers mainly, who wanted autograph cards for different events when they would have shows and concerts. And so there is what comes in, like it's a strange cooperation that is being created between her and them. And they were very conscious of going to her apartment and having themselves photographed. And also we know that they thanked her and found her services very good and recommended her. And at the same time, she's kind of helping them to become famous as German stars. So that's a very distinct story that we don't have that much in like really in other cases. She also still photographs Berlin, but she very much is focused on studio photography in her own home in order not to be out too much and just documenting these stars. Sometimes also bring their animals, and she would then do like animal portraiture with her photo camera. So that's an interesting case, for example.
Yeah, I would add to that. When you look at the photos, you realize something that appears in the literature, but not that much. For example, that Jews in Nazi Germany are taking vacation 2 times a year. And those vacation time are really important for them, really important also to express how they think of what they're doing there and to kind of justify their position in Germany, why they're not living, how do they feel as German and as Jews, and there's not a lot of literature about it when you don't look at the photos because it doesn't look like such an important thing. And the other thing that is maybe surprising and we all have these we all seen these collections, but if you have a collection which is rich and does have also memoirs, written memoirs in it, you can see how the story in the written memoir differs dramatically from what you see in the photos. So in the written memoirs, it's usually very simple. There are a few type of stories, but the stories are very simple. Like we thought we were Germans, then we realized we're not. Then we discovered Zionism, and we became convinced Zionists and so forth. Um, and then when you look at the photos, the albums tell a totally different story about the way they think of themselves and what they think about Zionism. And um, so it is surprising if you know other types of ego documents from the period, it gives you totally different stories.
Um, Anybody else, and I'm cutting off, that wants to weigh in on that? Um, I'm gonna I apologize if your question is still lingering in the chat. I am gonna actually use my prerogative again here as the person reading questions aloud to ask you something quite different in closing. I have a number of my own graduate students who are here today. Attending this session. And as you all have been talking about this work, I have been thinking quite a bit about how unusual it is in the American Academy for there to be co-authored works like this. Right? We we are deeply kind of invested in single-authored monographs. We of course have people work together, but largely in the context of edited collections. And I'm just so struck by what you all have been able to accomplish by working in this very different model of kind of bringing expertise and scholarship together to do this work. And I was wondering if you could say a few things about that. I'm not, you don't need to tell us any kind of gossip about the experience of working together as a group of four. But if you could talk about kind of what that enabled you to do as scholars to genuinely co-author kind of on this scale, I think that would be really, really interesting for some of the people who are here today.
Well, I don't think it's unusual. I think it's typical to do your own books, your own articles, also in Israel and in Germany and probably in the Netherlands too, Rebekka. So actually, what you're used to is what we're all used to, even if I'm from Madison, academically. And I think it's really a shame. I mean, I know it's a lot of work in some respects because you don't just sit with yourself, but it's precisely great because you're not just sitting with yourself. I don't think any of us could have found the number of photos. I mean, we physically could not have done this in the time that we have did if we had not been able to rely on each other, going to different places, interviewing people, looking at different collections. We wouldn't have been able to come up with some of the things. We wouldn't have seen things. We would have missed things if we hadn't been talking to one another. And we had 4 years where we were talking to one another constantly before we started. And then when you sit down and write, I like to joke that one of the things that you learn how to do when you write together, because we did write together, it wasn't just like, oh, you write this portion and I'll write that portion. We wrote, all our hands and our minds and our fingers and are everywhere on all of these pages. And one of the things that comes out is you can't just say, oh, this isn't clear to me. Sorry. You have to explain why it's not clear. And that really requires you to sit down and think about how to communicate effectively with one another. And it's sometimes hard, sometimes easy, but I think it really is a great exercise in learning how to communicate. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. So it wasn't just intellectually stimulating and fabulous to have, like, working with people and getting so much more done. And we also had research assistants too, really a large group of people helping. So I highly recommend that we start writing more together. I think it's one of these things that does become enriching, and also coming from different backgrounds, because we're not all historians of one field. Shira does literary studies too. I mean, this really also helps. And Rebekka is really much more a specialist. I mean, she does great work on everything vernacular, but you're much more a specialist on the professionals. And we can sort of rely on your knowledge about that too, which just really adds to this. And Ofer's done years of visual studies.
And we also, in addition to the research assistant, we made sure to always share our work with others who also published in the field, like in German history or photo history. And so we had regular workshops and would workshop specific pictures with them. And it's basically, it's a much even larger group behind that book, and to whom we are also grateful and who became great friends along the way.
Becca, thank you so much for making transparent the collective nature of that project. Shira.
Yeah, maybe just a short reflection. I mean, what part of the challenge of working with photographs, and specifically with photographs where we don't have, I mean, we're so much programmed in all the different fields. I mean, in history and obviously literary studies, to work with text, and whenever we don't have text, you find yourself speculating a lot. And I think part of the gain of working as a group was speculating together, and also having, I mean, going back to what Sarah said about communicating with each other, really, being, you have to stand behind, and to convince yourself and others in their interpretations. And we had lots of back and forths between us. And interestingly, it also makes you to, I mean, once a text goes through all the authors and it comes back to you, and then you think, well, it really doesn't make sense what I said there. I don't see it anymore. So there is this kind of very productive estrangement that is involved in the process, and I think it's particularly helpful by working on this medium and on these documents for the first time in such a scope and in such a way.
Thank you all so much. We are past time, so I'm going to end things here. And one of the great kind of drawbacks of the webinar setup is that you can't hear everyone kind of applauding at the end. But I know everyone is joining me and thinking this was just a terrific, rich session. Congratulations on the book. And thank you so much for joining us here today. And thanks again to the Mosse program for making this possible. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.